Okay, we'll start. Chapter 14. Now, I know you don't have a book, but nevertheless, I hope you'll get a lot out of what we're talking about. This begins really in part 3 in your book, beginning with the year 1500. And 1500, you'll find out in a little bit, is a very, very important year in the history of mankind. A couple of things happened. Number one, Columbus founded a new world about that time, 1492. In 1497, Vasco da Gama went around the coast of Africa and went to India by sea. And in 1521, shortly after that, a man named Martin Luther changed the Western world. So we'll be talking about the next 2 chapters. So a big series of events that were going on about this time. Martin Luther was 9 years old when Columbus discovered America, or whatever that's worth, 1488. Anyway, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but a lot of you probably have never heard of Martin Luther. If you go to the syllabus, you'll find that the password for the iCollege on this class is Luther. Give you some idea how important he was. Password Luther, you must capitalize the L. All right, anyway, chapter 14, New World. New World patterns. We begin with the year 1500. Now again, that's an approximation. If you had lived in the year 1500, you would probably not have noticed anything different or average between it and the year 1499, but there's always changes going on. Europeans were beginning at that time to, you might say, wake up and have more curiosity about what was going on outside. The history of mankind before the year 1500, and no, let me explain. You don't have to have had first semester world history to take this class. This is an entry-level course. You don't have to have a precedent. But anyway, the interest of Europeans. Let me stop. World history before the year 1500 is like a mosaic. You have a group of people living in this part of the world in isolation, a group of people living over here in isolation. And yes, Europeans were living somewhat in isolation from the rest of humanity. They knew about China. They knew a little bit about India, but not much. Very few Europeans had ever ventured over to Mongolia, China, India, and very few of them had ventured across the Sahara Desert deep into Africa. And the Americas. Yes, some Europeans were aware that there was a continent across the Atlantic. It is now known that European fishermen were going across the Atlantic fairly regularly, and they were transmitting European diseases to the Indians and killing off the Indians without them realizing it. And also it's now known the Vikings had actually tried to set up a colony there 500 years before. The colony had failed, and they left. But Europeans were getting their interest peaked up about the rest of the world. Some things that helped was the desire to spread Christianity around the rest of the world. Your authors claim, and your authors take the stand of view that more so than just merely Christianity, there was a desire for gold. The rich spices of the Far East lured them. The supposedly fabled wealth of the Far East lured them. A man named Marco Polo. Marco Polo was an Italian who traveled to China and went to the court of the great Kublai Khan. This is in the 1300s. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, who is ruler of all of China. Marco Polo became an ambassador, and he even traveled to Japan. And after being gone for 20 years, he came back, was captured in a war and imprisoned during a war, and he wrote a book while in prison. He found time to write, wrote a book about his travels. Some of the things he said we have a little bit of a difficult time swallowing, but nevertheless we know he was there, and his book influenced Europeans. It is known that Christopher Columbus had a copy of Marco Polo's book. There's another thing about Europeans too that made them different from other peoples. They improved their technology, technological advances. They improved the rudder on their ship. Well, actually, the Chinese invented this type of rudder they were using. A rudder that could be controlled from inside the vessel, not from one where you had to get outside and turn it by hand from outside, but a rudder that could be controlled by a steering wheel. And they also invented the more movable sails that you could twist and turn more than had been possible before. And instead of using the triangular sail, they decided they could get more power using the square sail, and they made it movable also, and made it to where the square sail could twist around. Now, some of you might have some idea what I'm talking about, but these sails that they invented enabled them to sail against the wind. In other words, if they wanted to sail west and the wind was blowing from the west, they could get these sails in such a way that they zigzagged a little bit, and zig, but they also would twist the sails in such a way they could catch the wind and make the ship go. They also learned better navigation techniques by inventing the compass. Well, they didn't. The Chinese invented the rudder. The Chinese invented the compass. But again, the Chinese inventions didn't seem to benefit them that much. But they then invented the astrolabe. The astrolabe is a device so you can point it toward the horizon, and it will show you what part of the globe you're on. And this was extremely important because before the invention of the compass and astrolabe, they would depend on the North Star to guide them. Now, that worked in the Northern Hemisphere. In our planet, we have a star that stays pretty close to true north, right above the North Pole, and they look at it. Well, the problem was, what if it was a cloudy night? No way to tell which star was north. And even when the sun was out, or even in the daytime, you couldn't see the North Stars. You could see the sun, but again, what if it was a cloudy day? What if it were a cloudy day? Well, the compass enabled them to navigate even on cloudy days and on cloudy nights. And the astrolabe, a little bit more limited perhaps than the compass, but it enabled them to navigate even when they were south of the equator. Now, if you know anything about navigation, when you get south of the equator, you can't see the North Star anymore. And but again, the compass enabled them to navigate even when they were south of the equator. Astrolabe, same thing. They could navigate from south of the equator. And this emboldened Europeans. Now, earlier in this book, in the previous chapter, the author stated the Black Death that hit Europe in the early 1300s enabled Europeans to be more bold and less fearful of death, and this encouraged them to venture out. Before this time, they'd had a real fear of death, but then death became so common among them. Black Death. Do anybody have any idea, folks? Here I'm going to get into something that might be an important hot topic. What caused the Black Death, other than the black rats, other than that followed them from Asia? But what was really behind it?
Irrigation.
What's that?
Or irrigation.
Irrigation?
Or lack of irrigation.
That's not really that, because they had a lot of rain and a lot of storms, a lot of bad weather. Oh, it was the same thing that was to cause a big decline. Yes?
Disease.
Huh?
Disease.
Well, the Black Death, yeah, disease. The Black Death was a disease. It hadn't hit Europe before, but the Black Death not only hit Europe, it hit all the northern hemisphere. It hit Mongolia, it hit China. What happened was resistance to disease was lowered due to famine. The famine was caused by a climate change. The climate change was a global cooling. The climate cooled down. What am I getting at? Folks, I would like for somebody to explain this to me. The best climate mankind ever experienced, or the world ever experienced, was during the period called the Cretaceous. During the Cretaceous period. Now, folks, this is standard paleontology. Anybody know what the climate was like? Yeah, anybody?
Sunny.
Sunny? What about Antarctica?
Cloudy.
Even Antarctica had a tropical climate, hot as a fireball. The climate was hot. There were no deserts. Life was abundant. This was the age of the dinosaurs. This was the age of, and folk, it cooled down. And so much life, 90% of the species died out. What am I getting at? I wish I knew. We're afraid of global warming. Last few weeks made a mockery out of global warming crowd. You may have heard there was a ship in Antarctica that got stuck on ice. You might not have heard it was loaded with scientists who were sent there to measure the thinning of the Antarctic ice cap. They got stuck in ice. The ship that's sent to rescue them got stuck in ice. They finally got them rescued with a helicopter and they put on board another ship bound for Tasmania, and that ship got stuck in ice. This was in the Antarctic summertime, by the way. They're having summer while we're having winter. All right, I'm going to have more to say about it because there was, after the Black Death, we're going to have a time called the Little Ice Age in the late 1600s, and the Little Ice Age killed Europeans by the tens of thousands, and also Chinese people in the Northern Hemisphere. It was caused by a cooling down of the climate. The best thing that would happen to life on Earth would be if the climate really warmed up. All right, then, have you heard? Yeah, it was warming up until the year 1998. Then the warming appears to have stopped and started to decline. Have any of you heard this elsewhere besides? You have, yeah, the climate, the warming that way. I mean, actually observe climate change, warming. These things, I mean, just go in waves. Like the stock market. It goes up, it levels off, and it goes down. It goes up, levels off, and goes down. Natural cycle. I mean, if the climate change had gone like we got the satellite measurements, it would be, we'd be having it hot right now. Except for one thing, the warming stopped. How did I get off on that? So simply this, the Black Death is believed by many to have influenced Europeans to become more bold and they want to expand their horizons. All right, the chapter opens up with the arrival of Vasco da Gama, very important name. Da Gama arrived in India. The year was 1497. I'm not going to emphasize dates a lot, but there are a few. The ones I put on the board I want you to know, but this one I won't. Now, there'll be another date I'll give in a few minutes I really want you to know, 1492. That one was really important. But this one, 1497, 5 years after the other. Anyway, Vasco da Gama arrived in Portugal, and your book doesn't emphasize much, but these ragged Portuguese sailors in a ragged ship, some of them are now suffering from scurvy, dirty and ragged, did not make a big impression on the people of India. But what they didn't know is these Europeans were going to eventually change Indian civilization, and eventually, not the Portuguese, but eventually they were going to conquer India. Now, if you know anything about your geography of Europe, you may know that Portugal is the last country on the extreme western end of Europe. Last one, therefore it's logical that they would be the first to venture. And they began to venture around Africa. They were led by a prince, Henry the Navigator. Henry the Navigator's father was the king of Portugal. He was the fourth son, so he never became king. His older brother did. He was the son of King John, and when King John died, the next one, the oldest son, his older brother, became King John II. But anyway, Henry the Navigator only had to content himself with the title of prince. He encouraged his people to explore, and particularly to go around Africa. And eventually one of them went around the coast of Africa and went to India. Now, they had some problems going around Africa. Is it locked? there was nobody at the time knew if the continent of Africa ended. They thought, well, does the continent of Africa go all the way around the globe? If they had read their history books, they would have known that the Persians had gone around Africa 1,000 years before, 1,800 years before, but they didn't have read their Persian history that well. This was before the printing press, before the internet. But anyway, they kept going farther and farther south until they eventually arrived in Cape Good Hope. Then Da Gama went around the Cape of Good Hope and went to India. And he stayed in India a few weeks, loaded up his ships with some rich Indian spices and said, I'm going to come back with a bigger fleet. He came back a year or so later with a much bigger fleet, and they loaded off more spices. And trade with the Far East was established. Now, between Europe and the Far East lay the Muslim world. The Muslims controlled much of the Middle East and part of India and all of Arabia and much of North Africa. They had been driven out of Spain and Portugal. The Muslim world, we're going to talk in a couple chapters more in detail about the Muslim world. The Muslim world was in a state of, I started to use the word decline, but I'm going to say instead of decline, they were level off. Basically, they reached a certain point in their technology and stopped. And the Western world, which lagged behind the Muslim world throughout much of the history of it now, just kept on advancing. Not only did the Europeans have better navigation, they also had better, bigger, stronger ships, and ships that were capable of carrying heavier cannon, which meant their cannon could fire farther than Muslim cannon. And that meant that they could open fire on a Muslim ship before the Muslim ship could return fire, and they could have the Muslim ship sunk before the Muslim ship ever got close enough to fire at them. Again, improved technology. We'll talk about this in more detail in the next about 3 or 4 classes from now. The Muslim world declined in technology at this time, and we'll try to speculate as to why. But they were not as advanced as Europeans. Now, that was not true before. Before this time, the Muslim world had been far advanced ahead of Europeans, but they stopped their advancement and went into a state of decline. All right.